aunque estaba ya un poquito desfasado. Vamos a tener nuestra segunda charla el día de hoy. Tenemos como invitado al doctor Bruno Fazenda de la Universidad de Salford de Gran Bretaña, y la charla que Bruno va a dar va a ser de aproximadamente 1 hora y va a haber espacio también para preguntas. Le agradecería si que pueden, por favor, apagar su teléfono móvil o ponerlo en modo silencio. Como les decía, la charla va a ser de alrededor de 1 hora y al final va a haber posibilidades para preguntas. Si alguien tuviera alguna pregunta concreta durante la charla, también puedes hacerla en ese momento. La charla va a ser en inglés. La presentación ya la hicimos en la mañana. Bruno es profesor del Instituto de Acústica de la Universidad de Salford. Trabaja con el área de percepción del sonido y él nos va a contar hoy día de su tema de investigación y algunos proyectos relacionados. Nos va a introducir también en el tema de la percepción del sonido y de ahí nos va a ir contando temas específicos relacionados con su investigación. ¿Okay? So welcome, Bruno.
Gracias. Okay. So as Felipe has mentioned, this talk is, as it says, perceptual testing for acoustics and audio, which has been the bulk of my work in terms of research. And when I was talking to Felipe about what I should be presenting, we kind of decided that it would be good to start with some basics of perceptual testing and little bits of, statistical methods, not quite the statistics itself, but the methods that might be applied for these tests. So the first, say, 10, 12 slides might be a bit basic for some of you, and I apologize for that, but it's kind of an attempt to bring everyone to the same kind of ground level in terms of the things that I will then be talking about. So after that, I'll be just going through 2 experiments of the many that I've been doing over the years, which kind of look into how we test for audio, the kind of problems, and of course, reporting some of the results. So I hope you will find them interesting. Okay, so we'll start with some basic considerations when we talk about perceptual testing. And the first thing really is to sort of bring the idea that when we're doing perceptual testing, we're basically using the listener, us, usually humans, as a machine, a measuring machine. And what we do is we say we want to study something, we want to study a certain factor, and we can quantify that factor, we can say how much it is, and we can feed that to the subject, to the listener, at a certain level. And of course, then we ask the listener to give us an answer. And that's where the subjective part of perceptual testing comes in, because every listener will have their own views, their own kind of ways of interacting with that factor, with the stimulus, and they will give us an answer, a response. And as we very well know, when we do this testing with humans, this response varies widely. And what we try to do is we try to collect many of these responses to see if people agree on a certain average, a certain mean, and based on that, then we can start making some conclusions about the factor that we've studied. So, when we want to kind of do perceptual testing, what we want to do is we want to quantify the perception of a given aspect. What we do, we vary these factors and we can measure them. We know how much of a certain stimuli we're sending in to the listener, and then we want to identify the response to it. And here we can classify it in a couple of fields. We could either look at the detection of the stimuli, whether people can perceive whether the sound is there or not, or how loud or how harsh it is, or we can ask the listener to tell us whether they feel better for hearing that stimuli or for being exposed to that experience. And those are kind of 2 different responses that we could look at. So whenever we go and do a study, we need to identify what it is that we're trying to measure, right? We might be trying to measure how sensitive people are to reverberation in a room, and we vary reverberation and we ask them questions about that. So usually we need to come up with a number of cases that we're going to present. If it's reverberation, we want various levels of reverberation, and we need some a priori knowledge about the kind of reverberations that we might be exposed to. There's no point in just testing really small numbers of reverberation if we know that no one's sensitive to that, or if we know that that's not the reverberation we're going to use. So we need to define a range which is useful for our tests. We need to present that to a panel of listeners, and that includes doing some modeling, some kind of coming up with the factors that we want to study, and we need to also design a way of passing that to the listener, which in our case, because we're looking at audio, we call them auditions. Okay? And then of course we also need this really important aspect, which is we need to obtain a meaningful response from the listener. And that, even though it might sound very trivial, it's not. And in subjective testing design, it's one of the things that I've seen over the years catches most of students and researchers alike unawares. You know, the kind of the extreme example is we're testing reverberation, but we ask someone how salty it is. It doesn't make sense. So the response is not meaningful. We need to ask a meaningful response, and that's important, very important, in order to collect the data that we're going to analyze. And then finally, and this is again something that most people, when they start doing it, they often forget, we need proper analysis methods. And usually here we need to go into statistics. If you want to publish a paper, you won't be able to prove any of your results until you actually have good statistical analysis that says, yes, there was an effect, or no, there was not an effect when we did the test. Now, when I do a special class for the students in the Masters, where we kind of go through all of these as the parts that you need to have in order to conduct a proper perceptual test. So basically deciding whether you want to take the test, defining the research question and the hypothesis, I'm going to go through that a little bit, reading what's been done before. There's no point in doing a test for stuff that's already been tested, unless, of course, you want to challenge those results. But also you want to know what type of methods are out there. And not a lot of people, especially in undergraduate courses, they come to their final year project and they decide, I want to do some kind of perceptual encoding like MP3 or AAC. I want to do a new one and I want to test it. And then when they come to test it, they forget to read about all the methods that have been applied before for that specific type of study. And that's of course very important. You should not be coming up with new test methodologies, especially when there are very well established test methodologies out there. Then you need to define the test. What are the initial conditions? What are you going to test? The factors and so on. Before you test, you need to start thinking about the statistical analysis that you're going to use. And that's because when you start thinking about the statistical analysis, you go all the way back and you start redefining the test. And the reason for that is because for certain types of statistical analysis, you need to collect data in a certain way. You need to have a kind of response, a kind of answer in order to get the responses. Then you conduct a pilot experiment, and that's really what it is. You basically get a few friends around, you've got your test designed, you run the test through them. And that's a really important point, because at that point, first of all, you are able to start documenting your experimental setup. And that is, where are the speakers? Where does the listener sit? How long will they be sitting there? What kind of information are you going to collect? What kind of answers and questions are you going to ask and get? That's really, really important. And of course, the pilot experiment will highlight other problems, such as, I don't know, the subject doesn't fit in the chair, for instance, so they can't put the headphones the right way around, or whatever. You identify all sorts of little problems that if you don't run the pilot experiment, you will never know. Okay, and that's really important. Then finally you go on to run the main experiment, you do your statistical analysis, you come up with a really top-notch, statistically significant result, and you get to write your paper and so on, and it's the end of it. But this circuit of actions is actually quite long. So the first thing you need to ask is, do you really want to do perceptual testing, subjective testing? It's a lengthy process. It will involve a lot of your time, a lot of other people's times. It's going to be very, very difficult, and all for a glimpse of a result. In most cases, you don't get a result from a subjective testing. It comes out as insignificant because you didn't have good testing procedure, because you didn't have enough subjects, or because what you're trying to measure doesn't have an effect. So you really need to ask yourself, do we need to do the tests? So the question is, when do we do listening tests? Well, we do listening tests if we want to find a preference of a system or a method over other methods, other systems. So we might be testing perceptual encoding or loudspeakers or whatever. So we might want to do perceptual testing in that way. If we want to identify problems, say we're doing the codecs, if we're doing some kind of filtering, which is an addition to some perceptual encoding method, we want to find if people are aware of that filtering or not, whether that degrades the quality significantly for you to say, actually, I can't put this filter in because it's going to damage the audio. Or when you simply want to know, how loud is loud, or whether people can detect the difference between two pitches, for instance. Now, when would you not do listening tests? If the result is already known, if someone else has done that test, why repeat it? Only if you want to challenge those results. So someone has published something, you don't agree with it, you've got an idea that that's not right, you're going to do subjective testing using exactly the same methodology and try to prove that those results were wrong. That's one time when you might do. But in many cases, if someone has done a similar test, just use that as the results. Or if there is a machine that can do it. So nowadays, we could be asking people, how loud does this, this machine sound to you? But we can go out with a sound level meter and measure it. So we can measure it directly rather than start asking lots and lots of people, doing statistical analysis, averages, and so on. So if there's an automatic way of doing it, then you might do it. Okay? But let's assume that we really do want to do subjective testing. So, the first thing we need to do is we need to think, what is it that we're trying to test? Again, that's another one that a lot of people fail on. They forget what it is that they're going to try and find out an answer for. So before you start designing a test, you need to really think about what is the question you want to know the answer to. Okay, so define the research question. And a number of examples of research questions. We might be trying to find out what are the quality differences between two different products or many different products. We call these conditions. Say, loudspeaker A, loudspeaker B, loudspeaker C. These would be three different conditions that we're presenting to the listener. Or we might be talking about preference of one condition over another. Say loudspeaker A over loudspeaker B, or MP3 over AAC, or Apple over Microsoft. That kind of thing. We might be looking for the detection of an artifact. Can people detect my filter in the perception codec? Or we might be trying to measure the performance of subjects over different conditions. Say, someone's mixing in the studio, and they've got low lighting, and they're mixing, 48 tracks, and then you come in and put really bright light on them and ask them to mix the 48 tracks again. You've changed the conditions and you want to try and see how well they perform. You might measure how long they take, or you might measure the final quality of their mix. Okay? So each of those will have example questions that you can put at the start, and they will start defining your test methodology, your stats, the data collection, everything. So these are really important. You might be asking, how does sound quality of loudspeaker A compare with that of loudspeaker B? Or which audio mix do you prefer, A or B? These would be the questions that you ask the subject directly. Okay? Okay, so when you're defining the test, you then need to start looking into statistical models and statistical methods of actually carrying out the tests. The first thing you need to do is identify what kind of variables are you going to deal with. And there are two types of variables when you do subjective testing. There's a dependent variable and what's called an independent variable. All right? Now, these variables can have different forms. They can be categorical. So for instance, we might be looking at people's age and we might be putting them into categories. Below 25, from 25 to 40, and over 40. These would be 3 categories, and that would be a categorical variable. Or we might be looking at, say, loudspeaker. Loudspeaker A, loudspeaker B, loudspeaker C. 3 different categories. But we can also have numerical variables. For instance, if I give you this sound, if I play you this sound, I want you to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how much you like it. And you know, one of you will tell me 8, another one will tell me 9, another one will tell me 7. So they will be numerical, they will vary within a certain scale. But we could also be looking at other types of variables, such as the cutoff frequency for, say, a filter in the loudspeaker, or the sound pressure level that we measure in a certain room. They are all numerical variables. Now, your test design, deployment, statistical analysis, all these techniques will be dependent on the variables. And then you look at the variables in terms of their statistical position. A dependent variable is what you actually collect from the subject. So, if I ask you, how much do you like this sound, on a scale of 1 to 10, that scale of 1 to 10 will be the dependent variable. But I will be testing over a number of sounds, say 3 different sounds. Those 3 different sounds will form the independent variable, so they will vary in some way. If we're testing loudspeakers, and we're testing, say, 2 or 3 loudspeakers, the loudspeakers are the independent variable, the rating is the dependent variable. So you need to keep these kind of concepts in your mind. So just a number of examples. We're looking at a comparison between 2 loudspeakers, say. Loudspeakers A and B are independent variables, but I might also want to test them over different musical genres, jazz, classical and pop. So each of these, which are of course categorical, they will be independent variables. I will have responses for each of them. I could also see how that rating varies depending on where I put the loudspeakers in the room. If I put them in the corner, they'll sound bassy. If I put them towards the center, they'll sound a bit light. So I want to see how that affects the response of the subject. That again would be an independent variable. And I might finally decide I want to test this over 2 or 3 different levels. Very loud, medium and very quiet. Again, that's an independent variable. So in general, if you can control the levels of a variable, that variable will be an independent variable. It's intuitive, it doesn't make much sense because it says independent, but it's the stuff that you can control that is usually the independent variable. And of course, the dependent variable is, ironically enough, the stuff that you cannot control, which is what the subject is going to respond. Okay? But statistically, that's how it's called. So, whatever the subject answers for all these different conditions is your dependent variable. And usually, what you're trying to do is you're trying to see what is the effect of the independent variables on the outcome on the dependent variable. Okay? Right. So then you need to kind of start going a little bit into statistical design and sort of following the route, the established methodology. So the next step is to define these things called the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. And they are directly related to your research question. All right? Now, the best way I can think of doing this is, or explaining this is, when you're doing subjective testing, you usually have an idea that you want to prove. Okay, I'll give you one. We often, in audio, being audiophiles, we might say that non-compressed audio is always going to be perceived at a higher quality than compressed audio. Okay, so we're obviously going to try and test at least 2 conditions, one where we've got full WAV file and another one where we have an MP3 at a certain level, okay, let's say 128. Now, we're trying to say that the WAV file is always going to have higher rating or be preferred or whatever, but in order for you to be able to come out to the community and publish that, you need to do your best to go against what you believe is going to be the answer, all right? So you need to do your best to disprove that the WAV is always perceived as better than the MP3. So you design your test in the fairest way possible, and you try and run it so you disprove it. If you cannot disprove it, then you've got a significant result. And that's where the idea of null hypothesis and null hypothesis significance testing comes from. You start off by saying, for instance, that the perceived sound quality of loudspeaker A is identical, is the same as loudspeaker B. In our example, we would say the perceived sound quality of WAV files is identical to the perceived sound quality of MP3. That's your null hypothesis. Of course, that then gives you an alternative hypothesis, which in our example would say there is a significant difference in the perceived quality between WAV and MP3. And what you do then is you try and run the test so that you can reject the null hypothesis. You can say the null hypothesis is not true, and therefore I can go for the alternative hypothesis that there is indeed a difference. So for our examples of comparisons between loudspeakers or preference between one mix over another, we could probably put these null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. For 3 and 4, where we were measuring the response to a certain artifact, you know, the detection of a certain artifact, we will probably just end up with a score, but we might still be able, and we should, still apply statistical analysis to it. Okay? So, when we try and go down this route of null hypothesis significance testing, we always need to define a criteria at which, if we're above the criteria, we retain the null hypothesis. If we're below the criteria, we reject the null hypothesis. And remember, that's what we're trying to do, is reject it. Now, in audio, usually that criteria is 5%, and I'll explain a little bit better what that means. But basically, we are in audio, we are kind of giving it a little bit of a more relaxed sort of level. If we were doing this for clinical trials, for medicine, if we were testing pills, for instance, for headaches or whatever, this level would be 1%. And I'll try and explain what that means in a minute. Okay? So here's what we do. Our primary aim is to collect the data and check whether it rejects the null hypothesis, right? We set the criteria at about 5%, and then when we do our analysis, we're going to compare these means. We're going to compare the mean of the people that said that WAV files are higher quality to the mean of people that said that MP3s are higher quality, and we're going to try and see if there's a difference between them, right? So usually we come up with tests, usually called parametric tests, such as analysis of variance or a t-test, and what they do is they check the probability, in this case probability P, that the measured results, the two means that we've measured, differ by a significant amount, that they're not the same. So in statistics we say that they came from the same population if we're under the null hypothesis. If there's no perceptible difference, the two means are the same, right? What we're going to try and prove is that they're not. If we get a result, it says that the two means are not the same, okay? Now this is where our critical level comes in. If the probability that those two means are the same is smaller than 5%, then we've got a result. It basically means that they are different, right? You can never say anything with absolute certainty, and that's the key thing about null hypothesis